All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So, are there any questions from last week? If you were here or you saw the recording, if you didn't, if neither of those things are true, there is a recording on YouTube for last week, which is accessible via our homepage, tnlsf.org. You can get to our YouTube channel. Any questions from the first class? Nope. All right. So we will continue the second class. We're going to, I know that last week we kind of ended with a discussion on the Four Noble Truths, the four things that are seen or known to be true by those who have a direct non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality. Those persons, those meditators, are at the moment of accomplishing that realization are known as Arya beings rather than ordinary beings, because that insight is so transformative in terms of how a person perceives and thinks and acts and cognizes. Um, Having that insight in the mind so radically changes a person that that person now becomes known as an Arya being, or in English, noble being. Uh, so the Four Noble Truths refer to the four things known to be true by those who've accomplished that particular insight, that particular meditative realization. That was where we kind of left off. But for today, we're actually going to kind of zoom out a little bit and start with a broader discussion of the mind, the sort of Buddhist model of the mind uh, that we have in our tradition in particular. So, at its root, Buddhism would assert that our mind possesses only two qualities. It is said to be that which possesses clarity and awareness. And kind of in the last class, we talked about, to some degree, we touched on the fact that the mind arises with states that are problematic, like anger and jealousy and attachment and covetousness and ill will, these things that we can't easily overcome. They seem to arise as part of the mind, or arises with the mind. So that can make it sound like this definition of clarity and awareness is, in a way, kind of optimistic, given that we've discussed that the mind is naturally, for an ordinary being, influenced by these states of mind that are problematic. So, this is a further example of how these words, clarity and awareness, don't imply that the mind is free from those states. Clarity here doesn't mean pristine, it doesn't mean completely free from afflicted or problematic states. Clarity in this context just means that it lacks a or color or size. It's an energy that isn't quantifiable by a smell or a shape or a color or a size, anything, any sort of quality of that kind. And then awareness doesn't imply that the awareness that arises is naturally unmistaken. There is an internal representation of what the mind is put toward that does arise in the mind. When we look, or we taste, or we touch, or we smell, or we use our mental sense to imagine, or to plan, or to think, it is true that a representation of what the mind is being directed toward dawns in the mind. That representation for an ordinary sentient being is going to come along with and be colored by, one or more of these not so beneficial states, these problematic states. There's going to be to some degree, an exaggeration that occurs, a misunderstanding, a misrepresentation, but there is an internal sense, an internal representation of what the mind is directed toward. So the mind is an energy which knows, or an energy which cognizes or becomes aware. But for us as ordinary sentient beings, that process still is affected by these afflicted states up until we do the work that removes them from the mind, which is what the Buddha taught, which was the whole point of all of the Buddha's teachings, was to explain in great detail how do we understand these problematic states, and then how do we completely excise them from the mind. That's the entirety of what the Buddha's job was in teaching us, to teach us how to understand these afflicted states, how they give rise to suffering, and how they are removable, and therefore how suffering can be eliminated. Um, but still, at its root, we say that the mind just has those two qualities. It's an energy that can become aware or can cognize. And so that process then for us as humans is going to be mediated by our body, mediated through the senses. Um, in order for the mind to be aware of something, you need to have the activation of one of the six senses. So Buddhism defines that as the five physical sense powers, and then the mental sense is the sixth. So you have, taste and touch, and sort of all of the five physical sense powers, and then you have the mental sense power. One or more of those has to be active, and then there has to be an appropriate object for one or more of those to be relating to. So the tongue has to be in relationship to an object of taste, the ears in relationship to an object of sound, and so on. And then the mental sense power is the sixth sense basis, or the sixth um, power, mental power. Well, sense basis is the best, because it's the mental sense basis. And that is almost always also active when the hearing, the sight, the taste, and so on is active. But what it does is it layers on top of the raw sensory data that we have. So when we touch something, when we smell something, when we taste something, when we hear something, etc., um, then there is bitter or sour or sweet or loud or soft or rough or smooth. There's sort of raw sensory data available to the mind. And we think one problem is that we don't fully appreciate how this process unfolds. And this, as a topic, is something that Buddhism spends um, a great deal of time and effort trying to help people get more clarity on, because so much of the arising of the afflicted states is involved with how we misunderstand the process of becoming aware of things. So, what I mean here is that when we taste something or when we hear something, there is that sensory level, but then we define it, we judge it, we label it as pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. We eat something and we think, oh, this combination of textures and flavors is something that is pleasant, or it is something that is unpleasant, or it's something that I could sort of take or leave. It's relatively neutral. And this can change over time, and these categories aren't fixed. We might be in the mood for something sweet or something savory, or something in particular. And so the way that we relate to what we're eating shifts over time. But every time we taste something, we layer on top of that raw sensory data with pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. And that's occurring in the mental sense consciousness. It's not happening on the level of the tongue sense consciousness, the tongue, the gustatory power of the body and mind. It is added to that raw sensory data, but it happens from a subjective standpoint. It happens so quickly that it is as if they arise at the same time to the mind subjectively, that the labeling of what we're relating to, it almost is as if it is at the same moment as the sensory data is being interpreted by the mind. And so that lends itself to giving rise to the mistaken view that what we're in relationship to is, possesses that quality from its own side, that it is actually delicious intrinsically or inherently or from its own nature, its own essence, is that way. Or, of course, the opposite, whether if we find it unpleasant, then we would say that it is inherently unpleasant, that it is, from its own side, its essence is distasteful or, um, you know, unpleasant or aversive in some way, because there's no space in the mind between the arriving of the sensory data and the labeling of that experience as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. And this is what gets us into trouble, because we have a really difficult time unpacking what's happening. And this reinforces our natural inclination to want to be in contact with what we enjoy, to want to be separated from what we find aversive, and to have no real interest in investigating or understanding what we find to be neutral. This kind of reinforces our natural proclivity for that, which is something that further fuels the rising of these afflicted states of mind. Um, so So we have the operation of one or more of the six senses, and then the object of awareness. And then technically, they say a previous moment in the continuity of the mind. So um, if you are in deep sleep, your taste consciousness, your eye consciousness, to some degree, your ear consciousness is maybe still functioning a bit, but some of your senses are not really operative in the same way. But then once you open your eyes, essentially there's sort of a nanosecond or something prior to being able to cognize an object of sight. Um, you need a previous moment in the continuity of that mind um, in order for that process to unfold. Is that so? That's kind of how Buddhism would describe the process of developing knowledge about things. It is the activation of one or more of the six sense bases, an object of awareness, and then a prior moment in the continuity of those sense bases. Um, and then, of course, like I said, the mental sense consciousness, it's what it does is something that we confuse with what the five sense bases are doing. We think that when we touch something that's pleasant, we think that because our pleasant feeling arose simultaneous with the touching, then that must mean that we noticed passively that what we touched is pleasant, or that we noticed passively what we ate is pleasant or unpleasant. Um, but we're discounting the mental sense consciousness having preferences, having learned certain things, having certain lenses, cultural lenses, lenses of past experience that are able to very quickly make a judgment about what data is coming in and then give it a label, and how not being able to unpack that causes a lot of difficulty for us. Are there any questions so far about how the Buddhist model of cognition, you could say, works? And of course, this is a very a more simplified version that you can study. This topic is called low rig, and there are long treatises on low rig that really go into extreme detail. Um, any questions? Nope. So then the next assertion in Buddhism about the nature of mind, because we've said that it's a non-physical energy that generates knowledge or awareness. The next assertion is that energy is both beginningless and endless. That there's not a first moment of mind, and that there's not a last moment of mind. That mind um, simply is an energy that generates awareness at all times, um, and that it's been doing that since beginningless time, and it will continue to do that endlessly. So in Buddhism, there isn't like a collective mind, like, so my mind and your mind are different mental continuums. My mind right now is associated with this physical form. Your mind right now is associated with your physical form. And we each have unique histories of that continuity. Um, because what mind does is it associates with form. um, we talked a little bit maybe about the different realms of existence last week. There's, kind of depends on how much detail that you want to go. And there's three broad realms: the desire realm, the form realm, and the formless realm. And then there are subdivisions of each of those realms. Um, the desire realm is the realm that we're presently participating in, and there's six divisions of that realm. There are there's the human realm, the hungry ghost realm, the hell realm. So I'm sorry, five divisions of that realm, of the desire realm: human realm, hungry ghost realm, hell realm, and then two what are called upper realms, the god and demigod realms. So five in total. And then really you can talk about, in some of those realms, you to some degree you can talk about further divisions to some degree, like the hell realms. There's different kinds of hell realms. um, so and then even in the hungry ghost realm there's like special cases of spirit beings. So it's a little bit more complicated. But essentially, there's five divisions of the desire realm, and it's called the desire realm because the predominant affliction is craving and grasping for external sensory experiences, is what kind of drives all of the beings who exist in the desire realm. Um, and then, so this realm is the one that sentient beings can take rebirth in under normal circumstances. When any sentient being dies, generally speaking, karma will ripen at the time of death, and they'll take rebirth in one of those places, one of those kinds of bodies, those kinds of experiences. The form and formless realms are meditative absorptions that a person, as far as I understand it, really has to be a human being who, in that lifetime, has developed through having a practice, doesn't have to be a Buddhist practice, but a meditation practice. They've accomplished the form or formless realm absorption. And when they die, they then have created the karma to take rebirth in that realm. And so, if they really grasp at that experience during, if they find it very pleasant, then when they're dying, they may gravitate toward that, wanting that experience. And they've created the karma by having accomplished that realm to be able to do that. So there are ways of still accomplishing the form or formless realm absorptions, but doing it with a more balanced mind, doing it for a more spiritual purpose rather than just enjoying it and wanting and craving and grasping at it as something desirable. There are reasons why a person might develop that concentration, um, but then they don't necessarily have to take rebirth there. But there's kind of a danger in a way that a person might grasp at it as something pleasant, and then they will take rebirth there when they die. And that's the only reason that beings take rebirth. You can't naturally, spontaneously die and take rebirth in the form or formless realms. You have to develop the meditative absorption of that realm in that lifetime. Um, yeah. So what the mind is doing is cycling through these different options. That's what our mind has done beginninglessly and what our mind could do endlessly, unless we achieve either lower nirvana or full enlightenment. We have the option of training the mind to develop one of those states. And then if and when that occurs at death, the mind will abide either in nirvana or as a fully enlightened being. And those are the two stated and achievable goals that the Buddha presented during his lifetime as being what a person could train themselves to do. If a person doesn't, then they simply remain an ordinary being, and generally one of the desire realm rebirths is what will occur after death. And then that lifetime will manifest and it will abide for a time, and then there will be another death, and then yet again another form. Um, so that's what samsara is, the cycling between all of these different options, these different forms that mind can associate with. So mind and body are different, which means, of course, that mind and brain are different for us, um, but mind associates with form. And for us, that association happens in the womb, and then it remains associated until the death of this body, until our body can no longer sustain that connection. There's a biological requirement in order for that association to persist. When the body becomes injured or ceases to function sufficiently, then that connection will be severed and mind will uh, be removed from that form and take a different form. So that's the other kind of major assertion that the Buddha made about the nature of mind, is that that is its existential condition, is to associate with form again and again and again. And given that there are drawbacks to all of these ordinary forms, all of these, we talked about, the different levels of uh, dukkha, unsatisfactoriness last week. All of these ordinary forms are conditioned by unsatisfactoriness. And so the Buddha basically said, given that reality permits the achieving of nirvana or enlightenment, and beings who achieve nirvana or enlightenment don't have those drawbacks. They don't have that unsatisfactoriness that characterizes all of the other types of forms, then that's preferable. Then we should do that, and we should help all other sentient beings to also do that. Because, again, the mind is beginningless and endless, and the option then that we're faced with is, do we want to experience endlessly this cycling through these forms, all of which are conditioned by unsatisfactoriness, or do we want to experience that eternity as a being that's not conditioned by unsatisfactoriness? And are we motivated to help sentient beings in general also accomplish that? Any questions so far? Yeah. So the question is, what the question from the Gompa is, what form does the mind take after it's achieved nirvana or enlightenment, when we have severed the the fundamental root of our suffering, and we've accomplished this goal. Um, and that, to describe the subjective state of a being like that isn't something I I know how to do. Um, the distinction, so of course we can qualify those beings in some ways. We can say that because suffering is caused by the afflictions, uh, these are beings who are completely free of afflictions, and so they do not suffer. They abide as mind. Um, the the form, I'm not sure the form of a nirvanic being, um, exactly what that realm is like, or what kind of body, what sort of subtle energetic body a nirvanic being has. A fully enlightened being, a Buddha, has the three bodies of a Buddha: the Dharmakaya, the Nirmanakaya, the Sambhogakaya. So, and they have their respective realms or environments. Um, but I don't know, they don't talk about nirvanic beings having multiple forms like that. The difference between a nirvanic being, well, they are not similar in that way. A nirvanic being has completely eliminated their suffering, but there are what are called the subtle obscurations to knowledge or omniscience that can remain in the mind of a nirvanic being, that don't prevent them from achieving nirvana, but do prevent them from having the bodies of a Buddha, being able to emanate back into cyclic existence, etc. Um, So we can say that they're completely free of all suffering. And in the case of a fully enlightened being, they've fully developed all qualities, all positive qualities. A nirvanic being, because there are the obscurations to omniscience, hasn't fully developed all of their positive qualities. Um, but let's see, there's a question in the chat. Okay. And I think the you should be able to unmute this week. I think we got it figured out. Sometimes it doesn't work, but I think it is working. So if you do want to unmute to ask a question, you can do that. I'm pretty sure. So when we visualize, are we connecting to the mind essence of these beings, and can fully enlightened or nirvanic beings choose to return to sentient form? So a nirvanic being, that's one of the main distinctions between a being experiencing nirvana versus a being who's fully enlightened, is that a being in nirvana is sort of cut off from ordinary sentient realms. They can only abide as their mind is in that nirvanic state. They are prevented from re entering cyclic existence under their own kind of power. There are teachings in the Mahayana um, that suggest that fully enlightened beings can reach those beings in nirvana, and can um, so, I mean, I guess technically, it's not clear to me if the enlightened beings have to teach them something, or have to give them some sort of, um, you know, help them in some way be able to do it. It could be that it just doesn't occur to them. They don't have the motivation to re-enter cyclic existence, because they achieved individual liberation. They were focused on just exiting cyclic existence because it's harmful for oneself to remain. That was what motivated all of their actions. And so it could just be that they never developed the wish, the motivation, the intention to re-enter cyclic existence, and so they don't. So it could be that the enlightened beings, when they reach those beings, that's all that they're kind of adding to the equation, is helping them to understand that there is more work that they can do to achieve full enlightenment. And they're kind of rousing that motivation in their mind, which then permits them to re-enter cyclic existence and continue their training and achieve full enlightenment. There are Mahayana teachings that um, explain that the enlightened beings can benefit nirvanic beings in that way. Um, yeah, and so your first, when we visualize, are we connecting to the mind essence? So um, for in the Mahayana tradition, all of the beings that are visualized are fully enlightened beings. Um, that's just the nature of the practices that we have when we visualize Tara, or, it's a little bit complicated because they talk, they can talk about these beings as bodhisattvas, they can talk about them as Buddhas, in different sutras and different, so sometimes the sutra description is one way, but then you have a Vajrayana, a tantric text that describes the same being in a different way. Sometimes bodhisattva maybe is referring to their bodhisattva activity and not necessarily saying that they are on the bodhisattva grounds and haven't actually achieved enlightenment. So it can be a little bit complicated because you can see the same being referred to sometimes as a bodhisattva, sometimes as a Buddha. But when we visualize, we're visualizing Tara or Chenrezig or whomever. These are enlightened beings. These are fully enlightened beings that we're visualizing. And a fully enlightened being, having completely perfected their mind, that mind is said to pervade all of reality simultaneously, because their mind, our mind as an ordinary sentient being, is limited to just this one body. But that's not because that's the nature of mind itself. That's because, due to the existence of the afflictions in our mind is kind of obscured and covered over by the arising of the afflictions, and it can't do anything other than associate with one form at a time. Because of that, once you remove that obscuration from the mind itself then can pervade all of reality. So Tara's mind, you know, Chenrezig's mind, all of these enlightened beings' minds are said to equally pervade all places, all of the entirety of reality. So, in a way, it's understood that we are kind of invoking that energy when we concentrate on it, when we bring it to our mind. We are creating a connection and we're kind of invoking that energy with us, present. When they say to visualize like above the crown of your head or visualize in front of you, you're meant to relate to that as the actual presence of that enlightened mind, that enlightened, activity that enlightened mind represents. um, so and that's because a fully enlightened mind does exist everywhere all at once. um, so yeah. Any other questions? No? All right. Okay, so that is the section on the Buddhist model of the mind. And we're going to switch gears a little bit again and now talk about what are called the four seals. Uh, and these here, the word seal is kind of used to mean almost like a royal seal. Um, that like the wax seal of a letter that is meant to authenticate the contents of that letter. That's kind of the analogy that's being used when you receive um, a letter from the king and it has the wax seal with the imprint of the signet ring of that king, what have you. Then you know that only the king possesses that seal, and therefore, you can be confident that the contents of that letter are authentic or an authentic communication from that one specific person. So these are the four things that we would say authenticate actual Buddhist philosophy. And this applies equally to any Buddhist tradition anywhere in the world. That if you can analyze what you're being told, and if it comports with these four seals, then it is a valid teaching of the Buddha. If it violates one or more of these four seals, it is not a valid teaching of the Buddha. Uh, so, the first of the four seals is all compounded phenomena are impermanent. All compounded phenomena are impermanent. So we have to define compounded phenomena and impermanent in order to understand what's being said. A compounded phenomena is any thing, any phenomena, any object of knowledge that exists as a product. To say that it exists as a product means that it has parts and it has causes and conditions that um, gave rise to it. So, a rock, a chair, a piece of wood, a table, anything, really anything in our world that we can touch, that we can pick up, that we can see, that can be moved, is a compounded phenomena because it is a coming together of causes and conditions, and we can say that it has parts. It has a top and a bottom and a front and a back and a left and a right. It has different various elements, which are, of course, atoms of different, you know, characteristics, different properties, um, and so it's a coming together of a particular chain of causality, meaning that a rock is the hardening of sediment or what have you, or it's volcanic, or there's a chain of causality that you can trace back. And then again, when you are relating to it, you're relating to a present moment incarnation of that chain of causality, but also you can describe it even in its present state as having a weight, having a color, having a shape, having a top and a bottom, and so on, having different um, what are called conceptual isolates, or you can talk about its weight, you can talk about its shape, you can talk about its color, you can isolate different aspects of it in with your mind and with your speech. So basically, for us, practically speaking, all things that we interact with are compounded phenomena, including the body and so on. And when we say that all of these things are impermanent, what we mean is that they change moment by moment by moment by moment, that no two moments in that continuity of causality are the same. Uh, they may appear to the mind, to the eyes, to the ears, to be the same. If we have a chair or a pen or something in our home, every day we wake up, we look at it again, and it seems same chair that was there when we went to bed. We talked about that a bit last week, how that's not true. In very, very subtle ways that are below the level of our sensory ability to perceive, the chair, the pen, what have you, is different. And it's different between any two moments in its continuum, because there's one atom that has broken a bond, in that moment, or added a new atom here or there, etc. Um, or the atom has just shifted position from one bond to another bond, within the same, kind of general place that it was. But in very, very subtle ways, it's never the same in any two moments in its continuity. So anything that we interact with can be described that way, as changing moment by moment by moment. It doesn't, as we said last week, I think, it doesn't demand that it ceases to function. It often would cease to function, tables and chairs and so on, after a certain amount of years or millennia, depending on, if it's a solid steel table, it's going to take quite a long time before it's no longer something that we would look at and describe as a table. But there will come a time when it has disintegrated to the point where we wouldn't refer to it that way. And we would say that it has ceased being that when that happens. But the word impermanent from the Buddhist context doesn't demand that that be true, because the mind is also a compounded phenomena. It has causes and conditions, it has a karmic history, and it has different conceptual isolates. The mind has wisdom, it has ignorance, it has emotions, it has logic, it can plan, it can imagine. It has different conceptual parts. Even if they're not physical parts, they can be isolated. You can talk about the mind's capacity for imagination, for logic, for emotion, for planning, for rationality, for irrationality, etc. And like I said, it has a karmic history. But the mind is beginningless and endless. It does not cease. It will never cease. But generally, things that are compounded will cease to be called what they are at some point, due to that process of momentary change. Okay. Is that clear? Any questions about the first seal? So then the second seal is all contaminated things are unsatisfactory. So again, we have to define a contaminated thing and unsatisfactory. A contaminated thing is anything that arises due to past karma and delusion. So basically, for this, anything that is not enlightened mind or the product of enlightened mind, like a pure land, is a contaminated thing, because it arose due to past karma and delusion. Um, the Buddhist understanding of environments like the earth, like other world systems, other realms, is that it is the arising or the consequence of the collective karma of the beings who inhabit that world system, that realm, etc. So everything on the earth is a product of the fact that the earth is a place where humans and animals abide. There are enlightened beings on the earth simultaneously, but by and large, the overwhelming majority of the sentient beings on the earth are humans, or ordinary humans and animals. And so, ordinary humans and animals, by definition, their mind, their body, have past karma and delusion as their cause, and therefore the environment that they inhabit is the product of past karma and delusion. Um, so that gets at the um, that level of suffering, of all pervasive suffering that we talked about last week, that there's no place that an ordinary sentient being can take rebirth in that's not unsatisfactory, because as an ordinary sentient being, you're taking rebirth in a place that is the result of the collective karma of ordinary sentient beings, and therefore it's contaminated, which isn't, it's kind of a harsh word, but it's the word that we have to mean what, if you find it a little bit difficult, just go back to the definition, which is that which has past karma and delusion as its origin. Um, if it has past karma and delusion as its origin, it's a contaminated thing, and therefore it cannot be fully satisfactory. It's always going to disappoint. It's going to be fleeting. Whatever enjoyment there is will be fleeting. Um, it cannot really, truly, fully be deeply satisfying in a real, permanent, lasting way. It will always lead to a sense of dissatisfaction, disappointment, because that's its nature. A contaminated thing does not have the power to be permanently, fully, deeply satisfying, peaceful, contented, etc. Only enlightened mind is like that, and the environment of enlightened mind is like that. Okay, so then the third seal is that all phenomena are selfless. Um, and this is something that we're going to have to come back to. Like I said last week, we're going to devote the fifth class to trying to come up with, as best we can, an understanding of, in a rudimentary, introductory way, the idea of selflessness, that things lack inherent existence. But, we can briefly say that, again, this goes back to that act of cognition where we taste something, we touch something, we see something, we hear something, and we judge it to be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. The sensory experience and the act of judging it or labeling it arise to us at the same moment, and therefore we make the mistake of thinking that what we've judged it to be is a quality that inherently, actually, findably resides in what it was that we cognized, in what it was that we tasted, touched, etc. Whereas that judgment is a product of the mental sense consciousness. So that's kind of all we can say about it now, because I I want to give it the full time to really look at that in detail, rather than maybe giving rise to misunderstanding, because we didn't go through it carefully enough. So that's the third seal. The fourth seal is nirvana is peace. Um, so, from our perspective, from a Mahayana perspective, the goal of practice is full enlightenment. Um, but the practitioners of the Theravada tradition don't have the practices that give rise to full enlightenment in their tradition. And so we can't say that all Buddhist traditions would agree with the idea that full enlightenment is like doable and practicable for sentient beings. But all Buddhist traditions, the Mahayana tradition, certainly agrees with the notion that the Buddha taught the path to nirvana as a valid option. So the idea is that when a being accomplishes that, whether it's lower nirvana or full enlightenment, then the mind is fully at peace. The mind is free of any delusion, free of any affliction, and is abiding in an incredibly deep, peaceful state. So those are the four seals. Um, all compounded phenomena are impermanent. All contaminated things are unsatisfactory. All phenomena are selfless, and nirvana is peace. So, for example, if a person says, that the Buddha taught that we should, try to go to some sort of like heaven, because there are heavenly realms, there are the upper realms, um, but they arise due to karma and therefore they cease. So they're not perfect peace. So if someone were to say, that the purpose of Buddhist practice is only to take rebirth in the heavenly realm, that wouldn't be a valid teaching because it's not the ultimate path that the Buddha actually taught. You can do that, but you still will die from that state. That state is temporary. Uh, any questions about the four seals? No. So the next section, essentially still going on from this idea of what is Buddhism, or what is a Buddhist. A Buddhist is someone who abides by teachings that comport with the four seals. They're also someone who has gone for refuge. Um, a person can study Buddhism, a person can practice Buddhism, can integrate Buddhist concepts without having gone for refuge, and that's completely valid. And a person may do that without ever going for refuge, but they're not technically a Buddhist. They are a person who is benefiting from and integrating some Buddhist concepts, ideas, meditations, and that's wonderful and fine. A person has to decide for themselves whether they actually want to fully become Buddhist. When they do, then they go for refuge. And they live by then five lay precepts, five ethical guidelines that the Buddha laid down. Um, and so, if a person doesn't actually abide by these five, which isn't to say that a person who's Buddhist would never make a mistake with in relation to these five. Of course, we all would make mistakes to some degree in relation to these five. Hopefully not egregious mistakes, but the real essence of it is that we would regard a mistake as a mistake, that we are trying to seriously abide by the five precepts. and that we relate to mistakes that are made with a sense of regret. We don't just think that it's fine that mistakes are being made in relation to any one of these five. These are the cornerstone of Buddhist ethics. And so a person does have to really take them seriously and really make an ongoing, sincere effort to abide by these five. So the first of the five lay vows or ethical precepts is to not kill. These are all framed as things that we should not do. Uh, so to not kill, uh, as I said, hopefully with regard to these, we don't break them in egregious ways. So there's a way of breaking these in a way that's called what's called from the root. And then there's a way of breaking them that damages the vow. If we break the vow from the root, then we are no longer said to be holding that vow in the mind. Um, to break this vow from the root, we have to kill a human being. So we have to observe a human. We have to give rise to the desire to end the life of that human. And then we have to engage in an action that we intend to bring about that intended result. And we have to be successful. They have to actually die. Um, if any one of those things isn't present, then we've not broken the vow from the root. We may have seriously damaged the vow if we attempted and they got out of the way or they recovered. That's bad. Karmically speaking, no one's saying that's good. But if they did not die, then we've not broken that vow from its root. We've gravely damaged it. But you know, however, the vow also applies to animals, even going down to the level of insects, um, cockroaches, spiders, centipedes, ants, all of those sorts of things are all also part of this vow. They're not excluded from the vow to not kill. Um, but that's much more difficult. That's almost impossible, I would say, to live 20, 30, 50, 70 years after having taken refuge, the refuge vows, to never kill a mosquito, to never kill an ant. And I mean that intentionally. So of course when we drive, if you even just walk on the grass, you're killing some things, even probably just by breathing in certain places. There are very, very small things that, you're taking the life of, but you have no intention of doing that. You're not observing it and then generating the wish for it to be dead, and then engaging in an action intended to bring about that result, and then being successful in accomplishing that result. It's ancillary to the fact that you need to drive or that you need to be, walking through a grassy area, etc. So it's your motivation that determines whether or not it is an intentional act of killing. So any and all intentional acts of killing are covered uh, under the vow with regard to sentient beings. Plants are not sentient beings from the Buddhist perspective. You can talk about studies and things about the complexity of trees and mushrooms and like how they can do really impressive things. And but from the Buddhist perspective, a sentient being is a biological organism that can serve as the host for mind, for consciousness. And a plant, no matter its ability to respond to its environment, or to have complexity, no plant can serve as the biological basis for mind, and therefore, from the Buddhist perspective, is not a sentient being. Um, Now, at a certain point, if you're raising forests and then you are affecting sentient beings. So it's not giving people carte blanche to destroy large swaths of wetlands and forests and so on. But if pick a strawberry or you cut down a tree or something, you've not broken that vow. You've not broken the vow not to kill. Um, any questions about the first vow of not killing? No. So then the second vow of the five is to not steal. Um, so to steal also has a particular definition, and stealing is to not take that which has not been freely given by a person who has authority to give it. So that is a higher bar than we might be accustomed to. Because from this perspective, if there's $5 on the street and we take it and we appropriate it as ours and we spend it, we've stolen, because that $5, we know it's not ours. We know, if we thought, well, maybe I dropped it, then of course that's different. But if we see it in front of us and we go up to it, we know we didn't drop it. We know it's not ours. Therefore, it belongs to someone else. And just because they aren't around doesn't give us the right to take it and spend it like it is ours, to appropriate it for our use. Um, so anything that we acquire has to be freely given to us by a person who has the authority to do that. So that also means we can't know that they stole it. If we didn't know that they stole it, but they did steal it, then we didn't break that vow. But if we do know that they stole it, if we're aware that it's stolen, then we cannot accept whatever it is, because we know that they don't actually have the authority to give it to us. Um, so what's interesting about this is that it can be useful to, if you were to ever host a Buddhist or maybe a monk or a nun, they might be holding this in a really strict way, which means they might feel uncomfortable drinking water from the tap or using the shower or eating anything if you've not given them permission, if they're in your home. So that's just something to keep in mind if you ever like invite someone who's Buddhist or a monk or a nun over to your home and you want them to like freely have access to water and so on. You have to say, please use whatever is here for your use. Please drink water. Please take a shower. Please take whatever is here. This is all yours, to use as you need. And then they will feel comfortable drinking from the tap and so on. Otherwise, they might be going thirsty. They might be going because you've not offered it to them. So that's different. So again, we may not have regarded, we may have held this differently up until the point that we've taken refuge. We might have held a looser standard for this, and that's fine. But from that moment forward, we're expected to hold this higher standard of not taking something that hasn't been freely given to us by someone who has the authority to give it to us. Okay, any questions about stealing?
Veneral Dondrub,
Mhm.
this might be a little far out there, but in the case that here we are living on land that essentially we could say was stolen, that some of the labor that has created the wealth here was stolen, how do Buddhists rectify that?
Yeah, so from that perspective, we have to basically, in one way, we have to kind of be practical, because you can't, if you're going back like hundreds of years, then it's not, you can't really trace back, you know, in a practical way like that. So really, by stolen in that sense, we would have to go by like a valid present day claim, um, that that we were aware of. Um, so if someone present day can enforce a claim that would be upheld by the courts, then that's kind of the definition that from a practical standpoint, that we would have to use, rather than saying, well, 500 years ago, or, then really it should be this or it should be that. We really have to be just a little bit more practical and say, well, does someone in the present day have a legally enforceable claim? And if not, then it's not stealing. Okay. So killing, stealing, so then lying is um, the third precept. So to lie means to intentionally say something that you know to be untrue, with the goal of deceiving someone who can understand what you're saying. Um, and so, if they don't speak your language, or if it's, a baby or some, so they have to actually be able to comprehend what you're saying, or communicating through writing or whatever, whatever it might be. But you know it to be false, and you are communicating it to someone with the intention of deceiving them, causing them to believe something is true when you know it to not be true. And, with all of these, and maybe this one in particular, we have to be practical and reasonable and consider the consequences of our actions. Because it could be that if someone is in danger and we reveal their location to the person that they are in danger from, we may end up really harming or being complicit in that person's death or injury. Um, and so there are circumstances where, if we tell the truth, we've caused a greater harm. Um, so it isn't to say that we, in all circumstances, no matter what the consequences are, have to communicate something that's true. We might refuse to answer something. We might refuse to, you know, say what we know. That might be better than, but, you know, it's a case by case kind of a thing. We have to really, um, think about what's the greater good, what will result from my action. But generally speaking, and with all of these actions, what the Buddha is really getting at is that in general, when we kill, when we steal, when we lie, the reason that we're doing it is self serving. it is because we're trying to get something that benefits us. Um, that's not always the case, though. If we're lying to protect someone, to make something work out positively for someone else, then it's not as much of a concern. It is a concern when we're manipulating other people to get them to think a certain way about us, or we're trying to um, not take responsibility for something that we did by denying that we did it. Those are motivations that kind of they take us away from our goal of achieving enlightenment. They move us further away from what we need to do to achieve enlightenment. And that's the Buddha's concern, really, is that broadly speaking, the motivation behind what he's calling these negative actions is a motivation that makes it more difficult rather than less difficult to achieve enlightenment. Um, so it isn't to say that it doesn't matter whether or not someone will be harmed. Well, the Buddha said, I have to tell the truth. And so, yes, that person is hiding, go find them. I don't care. I told you the truth. Um, it isn't like that. We have to be skillful in how we relate to these things. Okay, killing, stealing, lying. Any questions about lying? And so again, you have to know it. If you repeat something that you think is true and it's actually not, that's not lying. You have to know that it's not true. Craig, did you have a question?
Oh, no. No, I don't.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Okay, killing, stealing, lying, and then sexual misconduct is next. So sexual misconduct has two aspects to it. It refers to the violation of either a reasonable expectation of monogamy or something that's non-consensual. It's one of those two. If either of those two is arising, then it's sexual misconduct. So, and it's called in English often sexual misconduct is called adultery. It's translated that way, but that in our common usage that kind of implies a marriage, but that's not really what's meant here in Buddhism. What is meant is the existence of a reasonable expectation of monogamy. And that could be just a normal dating relationship wherein that has been agreed to, that has been discussed and agreed to. And once it's agreed to, then it becomes a reasonable expectation. Um, and then you violate that reasonable expectation. Um, Aside from that, if the other person does not consent, you've also violated the so that's a different way of doing it. But if either of those two situations has arisen, then you're in breach of the vow on sexual misconduct. So so this is, we can think of this as a spectrum, um, because if there is a reasonable expectation of monogamy, let's say, then that person, your partner, may rightly become concerned if you are having like a private dinner, in a romantic restaurant with a person that you might find attractive, without telling them. Like, that's a reasonable concern that they might have. That you weren't, maybe that's all that happened, but still, like, that could be problematic in the context of that relationship. From the Buddhist perspective, that doesn't really, I mean, just that could very, very lightly fall on this spectrum. Um, it's really talking about more physical kinds of things. Um, and so but you could say to some degree that that would damage that vow. Maybe you kind of weren't taking that expectation as seriously as you could. Um, to break it from the root requires a fully consummated act, and we all know what that means. So kissing, hand holding, those aren't, no one's saying that those are good, but they damage the vow because these are training precepts. They're not like, they're meant they're meant with the understanding that people make mistakes, and that we're taking these as training precepts to move in a direction that we want to move in. So there are many things that might damage the vow, but a fully consummated act would break it from the root, just like killing a human breaks the vow on not killing from the root, meaning that you've taken it so unseriously, you can't be said to be holding that vow anymore. Or, of course, a fully consummated unconsensual act would also break it from the root, whereas other things would damage it. Um, and when a vow is broken from the root, you have to retake the vow with a teacher. You have to go to your teacher and say, I have broken this vow from the root. Is it appropriate for me to take it again? And then they might say, well, here are the things that you should do between now and when I feel like you've changed to the point where you've matured and can hold the vow again, and then I'll give it to you again. Or they might say, well, that was a really unusual coming together of circumstances, like somebody broke into your home and you panicked and you shot them. Like, that probably won't happen again. So they might feel comfortable giving you the vow again, because still, I mean, you did take the life of a human on purpose. There's not an exception for that in Buddhism. um, but it's different than kidnapping some stranger, and it's different. So your teacher would look at the circumstances and decide what would need to happen. um, but yeah, that's sexual misconduct. So you avoid violating a reasonable expectation of monogamy, and you avoid engaging in anything that's non-consensual. Is that clear? Any questions? So again, Buddhism doesn't have if there is no reasonable, if you've agreed that you're seeing other people or that you have an open relationship, that might not be a great idea, but it doesn't violate this precept, because there's no reasonable expectation of monogamy. Okay. So then the last of the 5 is to avoid taking intoxicants. So killing, stealing, lying, sexual misconduct, and then taking intoxicants. An intoxicant is a substance that that does what's called can lead to heedlessness, meaning it can reduce your ability to look at to look at the world, to look at what's happening, and to be very clear about what's occurring in your environment. So, of course, alcohol does that. Reduces your inhibitions. It reduces your perception, your clarity of mind. Many other things do that. But the key is that whatever you're ingesting has to not have a medicinal purpose, because there are many painkillers and so on that also can do that. Your doctor might prescribe something for a particular condition. So the key is, if you are trying to get back to a relatively normal level of functioning because you are ill, and that's your goal, is to get back to a normal level of functioning, and your doctor agrees that whatever it is accomplishes that with the fewest number of side effects, etc., then it doesn't, at that point, it doesn't matter what the substance is, it is medicinal. And you may want to be cognizant of, like they say, not operating heavy machinery. You might want to think about staying home, limiting your contacts with people when you're under the influence of whatever it might be. But it's not an intoxicant. An intoxicant is something that leads to heedlessness, that has no medicinal purpose, and the goal is just recreational. Um, and the concern that the Buddha has about that is this idea of heedlessness, this idea that if we can't be clear about what's happening around us, then we can't recollect any of our other vows. We can't recollect any of the teachings. We can't recollect any of the antidotes to any of the disturbing states of mind. We're kind of powerless to apply what we're learning, what we're doing, to the situation that's arising, because our mind is impaired. Um, so with this one, it's a little bit, it can be practiced in different ways. It, the strict way of practicing it literally is, do not take intoxicants, do not ingest any recreational substance that can give rise to heedlessness. The more common way in the West is, do not become heedless, do not become intoxicated, which distinguishes the idea that, one glass of wine, one beer is not, for most people, is not going to be a problem, is not going to give rise to actual heedlessness. Um, and for most Western Buddhists, lay practitioners, that's probably the way that generally they are practicing it. The only other thing I would say is that it's probably important to have clarity about how your teacher is presenting that vow when you're taking that vow. If your teacher is presenting it to you as in the strict way, then that's kind of how you're taking it, because that's how it's being presented. So if you're concerned about taking it in the strict way, you probably want to clarify that with the person, your preceptor, the person that you're taking the vows from. Um, but because the goal is to just not become heedless. And if a person has a problem with alcohol, then of course that's also different. For them, one drink probably is too many. But if a person doesn't, then there's kind of a gray area that a lot of Western lay Buddhists are probably falling into. Um, so that's something that, to some degree, you have to decide for yourself, but also, I think, in consultation with the person that you're taking the vow from. So that's the foundation of the Buddha's ethical teachings: to not kill, not steal, not lie, not commit sexual misconduct, and not take intoxicants. And so unavoidably, a Buddhist is someone who's upholding those 5 precepts as best, really making a genuine, sincere effort to uphold those 5 precepts, and then regarding mistakes as mistakes and trying to do better over time. Any thoughts or questions about the 5 lay precepts? Nope. All right. So if there are no final questions or thoughts, we've reached the end of our allotted time. All right. So this was class 2, and we've got 3 more this month, and then we will be finished. So thanks for coming, and I hope to see you guys next week.